I feel a bit presumptuous because I'm not really the right person to welcome you in the sense that I did not do the bulk of the work for organizing this. I did contribute somewhat, but I think it is especially Patrick and Klaus who have put up the work. But of course, I came with the special extra benefit, namely Jack, and made the first proposal that we should have this meeting. And then Patrick came up with the idea that it should be on Prior's very centenary day. It is, of course, today, 4th December 2014, so it's exactly 100 years ago that Prior was born. And this is a seminar partly devoted to the further study of his work, and also it is celebratory. We celebrate Prior's centenary today. Patrick asked me to give a short intro, emphasizing short. Well, in fact, he did not emphasize it, but since we're already a little bit over time, I must stop droning on and get down to business. My intro is built partly upon my short opening and closing talks at the Arthur Prior Centenary Conference in Oxford this year, and partly on Peter Åström and my own introductory paper to the Sanctes volume that will emerge from the conference. So, first of all, let me give you my brief historical view on what we sometimes somewhat informally call prior studies. It is not, strictly speaking, prior studies, and in particular, Prior probably wouldn't have liked the idea of prior studies all that much. He was very much devoted to the subject matters, and indeed we also constantly strive to look at the systematical potential for contributions to tense logic and other related areas that we can find in Prior's work and elsewhere, and combining it. So, but nevertheless, I have called this intro on the enduring importance of studying Prior's works, as is also the title of Peter's and my entry that will appear in Sanctes, provided that it is probably peer-reviewed. Let me give you a little bit of the history of what I have now called Prior studies. So Prior died on 6 October 1969, aged 54 years. And as often happens when a prominent intellectual dies, there is some interest in the decade after. In the 70s, various of his posthumous works came out. In 71, Objects of Thought was edited and published by P.T. Geach and Anthony Kenny. And in 1976, they edited and published 2 further volumes based on the material left by Prior, that I will come back to briefly, namely Papers in Logic and Ethics in 76 and The Doctrine of Proposition and Terms in 76. And in 77, Kit Fine edited and also himself extended some of Prior's thoughts on worlds, times, and selves, and issued the eponymous volume, Worlds, Times, and Selves, in 77. So that is not atypical, and after that, interest waned. And I have been told, I'm not myself a science historian, but I have been told from science historians that is quite typical. There's this decade of interest, and then follows a waning of interest. And then we'll see. Then we'll see whether interest re-emerges, signifying that here is a recognized, lastingly important contribution, or whether it just fades away and you say this was a nice contribution in its own day, but also confined to that. So it was fairly quiet in the 80s, although one very important development took place, namely that Prior's works and temporal logic found its way into computer science. Amy Pnueli got acquainted with temporal logic first via the work of Rescher and Urquhart, and his first publication on it was, as far as I know, in 1977 on the use of linear temporal logic in computer science. But then a few years later, together with Ben Ari and one more, he published a paper on the use of branching time in computer science for verification purposes. And after that time, temporal logic has been flourishing within computer science. So that was one important development, began in the 70s, but grew in the 80s at a time where otherwise it was fairly quiet about prior. There was, however, one momentous event towards the end of the 80s, namely the 80th celebration, if you can call it that, on the death of a person. But 80 years after Prior's death, there was held a conference in New Zealand that drew together many researchers, and on which was based Jack's later edition, Logic and Reality. It was out with a few years delay in '96, but it did mark a resurgence in the interest in prior and was an important milestone. And now up comes immodesty. I may mention also Peter's and my own work that also took up speed in the early 90s. In '93, we had a paper in Erkenntnis on prior, and in '95, our volume on temporal logic, from ancient ideas to artificial intelligence, was out. So it was a little after the conference, but all of this contributed in the 90s, in the course of the 90s, to a resurgent interest in the works of prior. And also, in this connection, should be mentioned Prior's Nachlass in the Bodleian Library. There is the material that was deposited there very shortly after his death. In fact, just within a few weeks after his death in 1969, Mary Prior, aided by P.T. Geach, collected and made a first ordering of the material on Prior's desk in his drawers and so on, and deposited in the Bodleian Library. And a number of researchers, including Peter and myself and others, have been visiting over the years, and it has become an increasingly important source for prior studies. And Peter and I, with the aid of David and Jürgen, have built a website that describes systematically, or more or less systematically, although to the satisfaction of Bodley, I may say, the material that is that can be found in the archive. And now one of the important processes that goes on these days in prior studies is the digitization and the making available of this Nachlass. And finally, in the zeros, there are further hallmarks of actually an ever-increasing interest. In 2006, the handbook of the philosophy of logic, the successor to Neil and Neil, had two entries, one simply on prior and the other one on temporal logic, drawing heavily on prior. Since this work is authoritative in many ways and a very important work, this handbook, this sort of marks the fact that prior has now become established as being, you don't have a chapter there if you're not recognized as one of the great logicians. And also there was the reissuing of papers, of Prior's papers on time and tense that was out in 1968. That was reissued after a long run of editorial work, including Torben, Jack, Peter and myself. It was out on Oxford University Press in 2003. So, that was a brief overview of prior studies and their development over the decades after Prior's death. I think that one thing that has become increasingly clear is that at first Prior was recognized for his development of tense logic and, by implication, temporal logic. I won't waste time on the finer distinctions and definitions here. And I think it still holds true what Anthony Kenny wrote in his great memorial paper on Prior out in, I think, 71, where he said, without doubt, Prior's greatest achievement was the laying out of tense logic. But what has become increasingly clear through the last 2 decades of Prior studies is that there is a kind of overall fabric to Prior's work. He made important contributions in many other ways than just within, although that's sufficient to ensure the lasting value of his work, but it was not only tense logic and temporal logic. He also laid out the foundation for hybrid logic that has become a very important discipline in recent years, not least here at Roskilde University with the studies of Torben and Patrick. But of course it's an international venture, a very important new discipline. And of course part of the motivation for that discipline was that Prior's preference for what he called, and with MacTaggart, quoting MacTaggart, the A-series conception of time, that he realized that the so-called B-series conception of time also had to be accounted for. And he strove to develop a framework that could encompass both notions, although with a certain preference for the A-series notion and what he called the tense logic. But that was really the early foundation of hybrid logic. And there are also a number of other important contributions. Prior wrote important papers on ethics. He also had a view on propositions that was not commonplace in his own day. And he also contributed to metaphysics at a time when that was not very popular, in the heyday of ordinary language philosophy, and at a time when he was in Oxford. He also contributed in the course of his life to theology, to the extent that there is a modern theological conception based on Prior's ideas. And he also had some very interesting views on the power of, but also the limits to formalization. Let me give you a quote. In Some Free Thinking About Time, which is one of the papers dug out from the archive and edited and published by Peter, first in Logic and Reality, and later reissued in Sanctes. In this paper, Prior said, "So far then, as I have anything that you could call a philosophical creed, its first article is this: I believe in the reality of the distinction between past, present, and future. I believe that what we see as a progress of events is a progress of events, a coming to pass of one thing after another, and not just a timeless tapestry with everything stuck there for good and all." Now, of course, the thrust of this quote really lays out his basic conviction about how to study time, and underneath the wording here lies the A-series conception, which he favors, namely the real coming to pass of one thing after another, as opposed to the B-series view with time being sort of quantified and depicted in a timeless manner, you could say. But what I want to draw from this quote is actually something else, namely the fact that he said, so far as I have anything that you could call a philosophical creed. Prior was not a system builder. Well, I don't really dare call Wittgenstein and Heidegger system builders. I think that would have been anathema. In some ways, they were anti-system builders. But you might compare him with Heidegger and Wittgenstein and other philosophers who laid out a kind of overall, all-encompassing picture, in their case, of language with implications for human cognition and philosophy at all. And Prior never did any such thing. But with time and with the resurgent interest and continuing studies in Prior, it has become increasingly clear that it was not just tense logic and other haphazard additions, but that there are red threads and a kind of consistency in his overall work, and that there is an overall fabric to study. So I must conclude now, but I would like to say that my approach here has been very historical. And it's clear that there is a prima facie argument for studying Prior because of his historical importance, and also because he corresponded with so many eminent logicians. Partly, others did that too at that time, but he did it more extensively than most, partly because he was situated in New Zealand and had to do, he couldn't so easily go to conferences as you could if you were situated in the US, for instance, and so he was very dependent upon an extensive correspondence, and he kept up this habit also after moving to England. So you find a lot of interesting correspondence that tells us not just about Prior's work, but also about the emergence of deontic logic, modal logic, and so on. So there are strong historical reasons, but what Peter and I have tried to claim in our recent short paper introducing the centenary volume by Sanctes is that there is also a continuing case for continuing studies of Prior. That it is true that some of the problems that he grappled with, also some of the technical problems with intense logic, have by now been superseded by later developments of logic. But there still are some very basic questions in the Priorian paradigm for the study of time that, in my view, remain with us. That the relation of B to A series is still to be studied and discussed. Also the other points that I mentioned, his view on propositions, his contribution to ethics, are still worth discussing and can still, just like you might return again and again to the works of Wittgenstein and Heidegger, there is also a case for returning again and again to basic questions in Prior's work. I should also mention that he was, at least in his practice, perhaps not so much explicitly, but in practice, he was a cross-disciplinary man a long time before that became fashionable. He drew in his inspiration from many sources: philosophy, logic, theology, even literature, perhaps especially when he was young, but nonetheless. So there is a kind of cross-disciplinary approach to be found in Prior that has to do with his faith in logic. That logic is a language and constitutes an approach that overarches many disciplines, and that is an idea which, to us who love logic, is certainly worth discussing still. However, in his view on logic, he also realized that there are limits to formalization. And I don't have in mind here the well-known decidability results on Gödel's theorems, but also he approaches this question from another angle. And let me, in conclusion, just give you a few quotes. He says, for instance, the logician must be rather like a lawyer, in the sense that he is there to give the metaphysician, perhaps even the physicist, the tense logic that he wants, provided that it be consistent. He must tell his client what the consequences of a given choice will be and what alternatives are open to him, but I doubt whether he can, qua logician, do more. So he says logic places a demand on scientific work. But there are basic questions to be resolved that will not be resolved by logic itself. Only the consequences of various conceptions can and should be studied by the use of logic. And he, in one other places, said, there are clear, hard structures for formal logicians to discover in the world of change and temporal succession. But he adds, but I don't think that there's anything better to be said here than that some subjects do in fact have more order, more structure, more form than others. That some subjects are more capable of being handled by means of a formal symbolic calculus, and in these cases it is more proper than in others to speak of a logic of the things. If that be so, it also has implications for the scope of computation, even hypercomputation. Thank you.